Welcome everyone. Leave here in the comments where you are talking about. And now, let's get started. Amanda Martinez worked as a receptionist at a dental office in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. At 25, she shared a 2-bedroom apartment with her college friend Rachel, splitting the rent to make city living affordable. Her life followed a simple routine: work during the week, gym classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and occasional brunches with friends on weekends. Nothing extraordinary, but it was her life. Winter in Chicago meant leaving for work in darkness and coming home the same way. The dentist's office closed at 6 p.m., leaving her with quiet evenings usually spent watching Netflix or scrolling through social media. Rachel traveled often for her sales job, making the apartment feel empty most weekdays. After her last breakup 8 months ago, Amanda had focused on work and her small circle of friends. Her sister met her boyfriend on Bumble and kept insisting Amanda try it. "It's better than trying to meet people at bars," she said over their weekly phone calls. After another Friday night alone, watching couples walk past her apartment window heading to neighborhood restaurants, Amanda finally downloaded the app. Maybe her sister was right. It couldn't be worse than being alone. Setting up her profile felt awkward. She chose recent, normal photos. One at her friend's wedding, another at Millennium Park, at a Cubs game with her sister, and a simple selfie from a good hair day. Her bio was straightforward: receptionist who enjoys trying new restaurants, weekend yoga, and finding the city's best coffee shops, looking for genuine connection. The idea of meeting strangers from the internet. But her sister gave her practical advice. Meet in public places, tell friends where you're going, trust your instincts. Amanda set basic parameters in the app: ages 25-32, within 10 miles of Chicago, looking for a relationship, nothing too picky, just basic compatibility. After a week of awkward conversations that went nowhere, she matched with David, age 29, worked in insurance, with normal photos that didn't try too hard, watching a Bears game with friends, walking his dog at a park, smiling at a family barbecue. His bio was simple: looking for someone to explore Chicago's neighborhoods with, promised to never suggest deep dish on a first date. Their first messages were casual, talking about favorite local restaurants in Chicago winters. David seemed normal. He asked questions about her job without being pushy, shared stories about his office work, and made her laugh with bad jokes about insurance. When he suggested meeting for coffee at Starbucks near her office, it felt safe and reasonable. She did the usual safety check, finding his LinkedIn profile that matched his story, a normal Facebook page with regular posts and real friends. Everything looked fine. Plus, Starbucks at 2 p.m. on a Saturday meant plenty of people around. She told Rachel where she was going and shared David's profile with her. Just in case, the coffee meet went well enough that they planned a proper dinner date the following weekend. David was polite, looked like his photos, and kept the conversation light and friendly. He mentioned living in Lakeview, not far from her apartment, and working at an insurance office downtown. Everything seemed normal, which made her feel more comfortable. The first few dates were good. They went to normal places: a pizza place in Wrigleyville, a movie at Century Center Cinema, dinner at a Thai restaurant in her neighborhood. David was attentive, always texting to make sure she got home safe, remembering small details about her life. At first, it felt sweet, but things started changing subtly. David began showing up at her regular places: the Starbucks by her office, her gym, the grocery store. Each time he had a reason, he was in the area. Had started going to her gym because it was such a good deal. Liked the coffee near her office better than his usual place. Each explanation sounded reasonable alone. His texting increased gradually. He wanted to know where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. If she didn't respond quickly, he'd send follow-up texts asking if everything was okay. When she mentioned going out with friends, he'd show up at the same places, saying he'd been planning to come anyway. The questions got more detailed. He wanted to know her work schedule, her gym routine, which train she took home. He remembered everything she told him perfectly, bringing up details from conversations weeks ago. He started suggesting she change small things. Maybe a different route home would be safer. Maybe she should switch gyms to one closer to his place. Rachel noticed the changes first. "You're always checking your phone," she said one evening. "You seem nervous when you don't answer his texts right away." Amanda had been making excuses for his behavior. He was just caring, just wanted to make sure she was safe. But seeing her friend's concern made her stop and think. Looking back, she noticed patterns. David had slowly learned all her routines, her friends' names, her favorite places. He'd show up at her usual lunch spot, saying he was just passing by. He knew which mornings she opened the dental office, which days she worked late. She couldn't remember telling him these details. Then came the incident at her gym. Another member mentioned a guy asking questions about her schedule, when she usually came in, which classes she took. The description matched David, but he denied it when she asked. He turned it around, asking why she didn't trust him, saying she was being paranoid. Her phone started acting strangely. Apps she didn't remember downloading. Her location services kept turning on by themselves. Instagram showed logins from unfamiliar devices. When she changed her passwords, David got upset. Didn't she trust him? Wasn't this what couples did? The final straw came when her sister visited. They spotted David watching her apartment from his car, 3 hours before they were supposed to meet. When confronted, his friendly persona cracked. He became angry, demanding to know who she'd been with, why she hadn't told him her sister was visiting. Going to the police was hard. They said he hadn't technically done anything illegal, but they helped her document everything: the unexpected appearances, the controlling behavior, the digital stalking. Her phone had tracking apps she hadn't installed. He'd been monitoring her location, her messages, her social media. She changed her routine completely. Different train times, new gym, new routes to work. The dental office added security cameras when David kept showing up, claiming to need appointments. Her social media went private, location services turned off, new passwords on everything. The hardest part was feeling unsafe in familiar places. Every stranger could be watching for her. Every casual question about her schedule felt threatening. Chicago felt smaller, her neighborhood less friendly. Even simple things like getting coffee or going to the gym required planning, awareness, constant vigilance. Recovery meant learning to trust her instincts again. Small red flags she'd ignored now seemed obvious. The too perfect memory of details she hadn't shared. The constant, coincidental meeting. The gradual isolation from friends. She kept the dating app deleted, not from fear, but from understanding that rushing into trust could be dangerous. Her life returned to normal. But with new awareness, she still worked at the dental office, still met friends for brunch, still lived her regular life. But now she understood that ordinary people could hide dangerous obsessions, and that the scariest predators don't look threatening. They look exactly like everyone else. Sarah Chen worked as a bank teller at a local credit union in Boston's Back Bay. At 26, she lived in a modest apartment in Allston with 2 roommates, taking the Green Line to work each morning like thousands of other young professionals. Her daily routine was simple: work, occasional happy hours with coworkers, Netflix marathons, and trying to stay warm during Boston's endless winters. Her apartment building wasn't fancy, just a 3-story walk-up with creaky stairs and temperamental heating. But it was home. Her roommates Jenny and Mike were both teachers, which meant quiet evenings during the week, and a steady stream of school stories over shared dinners. After her relationship of 2 years ended last summer, Sarah had settled into a comfortable but lonely routine. The first strange notes appeared a week before she downloaded Bumble. Just scraps of paper in her mailbox, a coffee shop receipt, a torn train ticket, a grocery list, things that could have slipped in by mistake. Except they all had her shopping habits, her regular stops, her routines. When she mentioned it to her roommates, they suggested installing a camera facing their mailboxes. But it felt like an overreaction, probably just mixed up mail. Winter nights in Boston were getting longer, and the empty side of her bed wasn't getting any warmer. Her co-worker Maria met her girlfriend on Bumble last year and kept insisting Sarah try it. Just be smart about it, Maria advised during their lunch break, after finding another note in her mailbox, this time a receipt from her regular coffee shop with yesterday's date. Sarah finally downloaded the app. Maybe meeting someone new would help shake the growing unease. Her profile was basic. Recent photos at Boston Common, cheering at a Red Sox game, celebrating Maria's birthday at a local restaurant. Her bio kept it simple: bank teller who enjoys good books, better coffee, and exploring the city. Looking to meet genuine people. No mention of her workplace or neighborhood. Maria had warned her about sharing too much. James's profile seemed normal enough. Age 30, working in finance downtown, with regular photos, playing basketball at a community center, hiking in the Blue Hills, dinner with friends at a restaurant she recognized. His bio was straightforward. Financial analyst seeking real connection. Let's grab coffee and see if we click. Their first messages were casual, talking about Boston winters, favorite restaurants, normal stuff. James seemed interesting without trying too hard. He asked about her work without pressing for details, shared funny stories about office life, knew enough about banking to have real conversations without making it feel like a job interview. When he suggested meeting at Tat Bakery downtown, it felt safe. public place, always crowded, close to her work. Sarah did the usual checks first, finding his LinkedIn profile showing a steady job history, normal social media presence, mutual connections that made sense in Boston's financial world. Everything looked right, maybe too right. The day before their planned meeting, Sarah found something odd in her mailbox. A Tate Bakery receipt from that morning, for the exact drink she usually ordered. She hadn't been there in weeks when she mentioned this to James while confirming their meeting. He joked about great minds thinking alike. Something about his response felt rehearsed. Their first meeting felt like déjà vu. James knew which table she'd choose before she got there, the one with the view of both exits. Not too close to the windows, he ordered her usual drink without asking, explaining he'd noticed it in their chats. Though she hadn't mentioned it, his smile never quite reached his eyes. Small things kept nagging at her. James claimed to work in finance, but didn't know recent office gossip from the financial district. He mentioned meetings in buildings she knew were vacant. His stories about local restaurants included details that were slightly wrong, like he'd researched them rather than visited. More receipts appeared in her mailbox. Places she'd been, things she'd bought, all from the past week. Some were crumpled like they'd been pulled from trash. Others looked fresh. When she saw James watching her building from across the street one morning, he said he'd been in the area for a meeting. Her building was nowhere near any financial offices. Her roommates noticed things moving in their apartment. Small changes in furniture positions, items slightly relocated, windows unlocked that they were sure they'd locked. The building manager checked the security cameras but found gaps in the footage. Periods of static at odd hours. Sarah started photographing her room before leaving each day. Comparing details when she returned, the facade cracked during their fourth date. James mentioned a conversation she'd had with her roommates that morning, one he couldn't have known about. When confronted, his friendly demeanor slipped. "You really should be more careful about closing your bedroom window," he said. All sorts of people could be listening. Research revealed the holes in his story. The financial firm he claimed to work for had never heard of him. His LinkedIn profile was created 3 months ago, filled with connections to people who didn't exist. The photos on his dating profile were expertly edited. Faces merged so smoothly you had to zoom in to spot the inconsistencies. The police found evidence of stalking going back weeks before their match. Photographs of her daily routine, notes about her schedule, copies of her keys that shouldn't exist. He'd been studying her long before matching on Bumble, crafting his entire persona to match what she might want. The dating app was just his way in, not his starting point. Other women in Boston came forward with similar stories. Matches with someone using different names but the same methods. Always mirroring their lives perfectly. Always knowing too much. Always collecting little pieces of their routines. The receipts were his signature, his way of showing how close he could get without being caught. Sarah moved apartments, changed her commute, altered every routine, but the feeling of being watched remained. She'd catch reflections in train windows of someone looking away too quickly, glimpse familiar shapes ducking around corners, find new receipts slipped under her door. Despite the building's security, her phone became a source of anxiety. Notifications that disappeared when checked. Emails marked, read that she hadn't opened. Location services turning themselves on. She changed passwords, got a new number. But technology started feeling like it was working against her. Each device a potential window into her life. Work became an exercise in constant awareness. She'd scan the lobby before entering, check sightlines from the teller window. Note every customer who lingered too long. Her co-workers learned to warn her about unfamiliar men asking for her schedule, about financial advisors wanting to. Boston felt smaller now. Every coffee shop could be hiding someone who knew her order before she made it. Every receipt could be a message. Every discarded ticket a warning. She kept living her life. She refused to let fear win. But now, with the constant knowledge that someone had studied her enough to become a perfect match, only to reveal the horror behind the mirror, the dating apps were deleted. But life slipped into a new normal. Sarah still worked at the bank, still met friends for dinner, still tried to build a life in Boston. But now she understood that the scariest predators were the ones who took time to study their prey, who collected the small details of ordinary lives and twisted them into weapons. Every morning she checked her mailbox with shaking hand, knowing that somewhere out there, someone was still saving her receipts, still watching, still waiting to show her how well he knew her life. Rachel Turner worked as a waitress at a popular brunch spot in Seattle's Capitol Hill. At 25, she shared a small 2-bedroom apartment with her best friend from high school, splitting the rent to afford living in the city. Her life followed a predictable pattern. Morning shifts at the restaurant, evening classes working toward her teaching degree, and weekend shifts to make extra money. Nothing special, but it was her life. Seattle's constant rain meant many of her evenings were spent inside, studying or watching shows with her roommate Ashley. Their apartment wasn't fancy, just a second-floor unit in an older building with drafty windows and noisy pipes. But it was home. After her last relationship ended 6 months ago, Rachel had focused on work and school, trying to convince herself that being single was better than dating the wrong person. The first odd thing she noticed was someone requesting to follow her private Instagram account, a profile with no posts and a generic name. She declined it, but more requests kept coming from similar blank accounts. When she mentioned it to Ashley, her roommate shrugged it off as spam, but something about the timing felt wrong. Ashley met her boyfriend on Bumble and kept insisting Rachel try it. "It's not like meeting random people at the restaurant," she said over their shared dinner. After another lonely Friday night shift watching couples enjoy romantic meals, Rachel finally downloaded the app. Maybe it would be better than the awkward flirting she dealt with at work. Her profile was simple: smiling at work, keeping the restaurant sign out of frame, hiking at Discovery Park, at a Seahawks game with friends, and getting coffee at her favorite local spot. Her bio stayed basic: waitress and future teacher who loves good food, better coffee, and exploring the city, looking for something real. Nothing that could identify where she worked or lived. Mike's profile seemed perfectly normal. Age 28, high school teacher, with regular photos, grading papers at a coffee shop, playing basketball with friends, walking his dog at a local park. His bio was straightforward: teacher who understands early mornings and late papers, looking for someone to explore Seattle's coffee shops with. Their first conversations felt natural, talking about working with people, favorite local spots, normal stuff. Mike seemed genuine, asking about her teaching studies without being pushy, sharing funny stories about his students, showing interest in her work without making it weird. When he suggested meeting at a popular coffee shop near Pike Place, it seemed safe enough. Sarah checked him out first, finding a LinkedIn that showed his teaching career, normal social media presence, and some mutual friends who made sense for Seattle. Everything looked right, but something about how perfect it all seemed made her slightly uneasy. Still, she agreed to meet, telling Ashley all the details just in case. The day before their planned coffee date, Rachel noticed someone watching the restaurant during her entire shift. Every time she looked up, she caught a glimpse of someone quickly looking away. When she mentioned it to Mike later, he seemed too interested in the details of her work schedule and the restaurant's layout. Their coffee meeting felt scripted. Mike knew which table she'd pick, the one with a view of both the door and the street. He knew her coffee order before she made it, claiming he'd noticed it in her photos, though she hadn't posted any pictures of her drinks. His smile was perfect but practiced, like he'd rehearsed every expression. Small inconsistencies started appearing. Mike said he taught at a local high school, but none of her teacher program classmates had heard of him. He mentioned faculty meetings on days schools were closed. He knew details about her restaurant that she hadn't shared, which tables she usually served, when her breaks were, which managers were on which shifts. The restaurant's regulars started mentioning a new customer, someone who came in during all her shifts but only ordered coffee, staying for hours while writing in a notebook. When she worked different sections, he moved to keep her in. If she switched shifts with someone, he somehow knew and appeared during her new schedule. Her phone started acting strange. Apps she didn't download appeared. Her location services kept turning on by themselves. Her social media showed logins from unknown devices. When she changed her passwords, she got locked out of her own accounts, the recovery emails going to addresses she didn't recognize. The facade broke during a slow afternoon shift. Rachel spotted Mike sitting in another server's section, pretending not to know her. He'd been there for hours, she realized, taking notes and watching her work. When confronted, his friendly teacher persona cracked. "You should be more careful about your closing shifts," he said. "Anyone could follow you to your car." Investigation revealed that Mike wasn't a teacher at all. The school he claimed to work at had never heard of him. His social media was carefully constructed, filled with stolen photos and fake connections. He'd been studying her routine for months before matching on Bumble, learning her patterns, crafting his identity to match what she might want. The police found detailed notes in his car, her schedule, her routes home, conversations she'd had with customers, photos taken through the restaurant windows. He'd been documenting her life long before they matched, using the dating app as just another way to get closer. The coffee shop meeting was a test to see how much she'd noticed. Other servers from different restaurants came forward with similar stories. Matches with someone using various names, but the same methods. Always knowing too much about their routines. Always showing up during shifts. Always watching and taking notes. He targeted people in service jobs, using their predictable schedules and public workplaces against them. Rachel changed restaurants, switched her teaching program to a different district, moved to a new apartment, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Every customer who stayed too long made her nervous. Every notebook could be hiding notes about her movements. Every coffee order could be from someone studying her routine. The hardest part was feeling unsafe in normal places. Coffee shops, once a favorite study spot, now required constant vigilance. She sat with her back to walls, watched reflections in windows, noticed everyone who looked at their phones too long. Work became an exercise in surveillance. Scanning sections for familiar faces, checking for notebooks, monitoring who lingered past their meals. Her phone and social media became sources of anxiety. Even after changing numbers and deleting accounts, she'd find new friend requests from blank profiles, messages from unknown numbers referencing conversations they'd never had. Technology felt hostile. Each device a potential window into her life for someone who wanted to watch. Seattle felt smaller, its familiar neighborhoods now marked with invisible warnings. She kept working, kept studying to become a teacher, refused to let fear stop her life, but she understood now that some predators didn't look threatening. They looked exactly like everyone else, carefully crafting perfect images to hide their true nature. The dating apps were long deleted, but the lesson remained. Rachel still served tables, still attended classes, still lived her life, but now she knew that the scariest people weren't the obvious threats. They were the ones who took time to study you, who learned your patterns, who used ordinary routines against you every shift. She watched the customers who watched her, knowing that somewhere out there, someone might still be taking notes. Emily Parker worked as a barista at a busy Starbucks in downtown Chicago. At 24, she lived with 2 roommates in a 3-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park, taking the Blue Line to work each morning like thousands of other young people in the city. Her routine was simple: morning shifts at Starbucks, evening classes at community college studying business, and trying to save enough money to eventually open her own cafe. The apartment wasn't anything special, just a typical Chicago 3-flat with creaky hardwood floors and radiator heat that clanked all winter. Her roommates Lisa and Tom were both retail workers, which meant they all understood irregular schedules and shared complaints about difficult customers. After breaking up with her boyfriend of 2 years, Emily had thrown herself into work and school, trying to stay too busy to feel lonely. Winter in Chicago was brutal this year, with wind chills making even the short walk from the train station feel endless. Her social life had shrunk to quick chats with regular customers and occasional drinks with coworkers after shifts. Most evenings were spent studying at her kitchen table, watching the winter light fade through windows that never seemed quite warm enough. Her coworker Jenna met her fiancé on Bumble and wouldn't stop talking about how perfect they were. "Just be smart about it," she advised while they closed the store one night. After another evening of watching couples share warm drinks while she made them, Emily finally downloaded the app. Maybe meeting someone new would make the winter feel less cold. Her profile kept things simple: a few normal selfies, one at the Bean with visiting friends, another at a Cubs game, and one from her cousin's wedding. Her bio was basic: barista and student who loves good coffee and better conversations, looking for someone genuine. No mention of which Starbucks she worked. Jenna had warned her about being too specific. Brian's profile seemed normal enough. Age 27, working in sales downtown with regular photos, playing with his dog at the park, out with friends at a sports bar, cooking in a normal-looking kitchen. His bio was straightforward: sales rep who knows all the best coffee shops in Chicago. Let's grab a drink and see what happens. Their first messages were casual, talking about Chicago weather, favorite neighborhoods, regular stuff. Brian seemed nice without trying too hard. He asked about her work without getting too personal, shared funny customer service stories from his sales job, knew enough about coffee to have real conversations without being pretentious when he suggested meeting at a popular cafe, not her Starbucks. It seemed safe, public place, always busy with people. Early afternoon on a weekend, Emily did her usual checks, finding his LinkedIn showing a normal job history, regular social media presence, nothing that raised red flags. Everything looked right, maybe too right. The morning of their planned meeting, something odd happened. A customer at work knew her name before she wore her name tag, ordered her usual drink when she was on break, and disappeared before she could ask how they knew. When she mentioned this to Brian while confirming their meeting, he joked that maybe he had a spy in her store. His laugh sounded rehearsed. Their first meeting felt strangely familiar. Brian knew which seat she'd choose, the one where she could see both the door and the street. He knew how she took her coffee without asking, claiming he'd noticed her cup in her photos, though she never posted pictures of her drinks. His smile looked practiced, like he'd studied how to appear friendly. Little things kept adding up. Brian said he worked in sales but seemed to have no set schedule. He appeared at her Starbucks during different shifts, always with a reason that almost made sense. He knew which tables she usually served, which regulars she chatted with, details she hadn't shared about her routines. Regular customers started mentioning a guy who asked questions about her, when she worked, if she was single, what time she usually took breaks. When she switched shifts with someone, he somehow knew and appeared during her new schedule. His sales job supposedly moved offices, always closer to wherever she happened to be. Her phone started showing signs of interference. Unknown apps appearing, location services turning on by themselves, social media accounts showing logins she didn't recognize. Each time she changed passwords, the problems returned. Brian always had tech advice, always knew exactly what might be wrong, always offered to help fix things. The reality broke open during a closing shift. Emily caught Brian watching the store from his car hours after he'd claimed to be in meetings across town. When confronted, his friendly persona disappeared. "You really should vary your route home," he said. "Taking the same Blue Line train every night makes things too easy." Investigation revealed holes in his story. The sales company he claimed to work for didn't exist. His social media was carefully constructed, filled with edited photos and fake connections. He'd been watching her for months before matching on Bumble, learning her schedule, crafting his personality to match what she might want in a partner. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed how long it had been going on. Footage of him following her to and from work, documenting her routines. Taking photos through the store windows, the dating app was just his final step, a way to get closer after months of surveillance. He'd been planning everything, down to which cafe to suggest for their first meeting. Other baristas from different coffee shops around Chicago came forward with similar stories. Matches with someone using different names but the same methods. Always knowing their schedules, always showing up during shifts, always watching and gathering information. He targeted service workers, using their public workplaces and predictable routines against them. Emily changed stores, switched train lines, moved apartments, but the feeling of being watched stayed with her. Every customer who lingered too long made her nervous. Every sales rep who came in could be collecting information. Every friendly conversation could be reconnaissance for someone else's plans. The hardest part was losing the comfort of routine. Work became an exercise in constant awareness. Watching who watched her, noticing who stayed too long, tracking anyone who appeared too regularly. Even making coffee required vigilance, checking cup labels for hidden messages, watching for faces she'd seen too often. Her phone became a source of anxiety rather than connection, even after changing numbers and locking down her social media. Strange things kept happening. Messages from unknown numbers knowing her schedule, friend requests from empty profiles, apps reappearing after being deleted. Technology felt like a trap, each device a potential window into her life. Chicago felt different now, its familiar streets marked with invisible warnings. She kept working, kept studying, refused to let fear win. But she understood now that some predators didn't look dangerous. They looked perfectly normal, carefully crafted to seem safe until they weren't. Every shift, she watched the watchers, knowing that somewhere, someone might still be learning her patterns. The dating apps were gone, but the awareness remained. Emily still served coffee, still took classes, still lived her life. But now she knew that the scariest people weren't the obvious threats. They were the ones who took time to study you, who learned your habits, who used ordinary routines as weapons. Every morning, she scanned the line of customers, wondering if today someone would remember her order before she wore her name tag. Jessica Thompson worked as a retail associate at Target in suburban Denver, living paycheck to paycheck like most 25-year-olds she knew. Her small one-bedroom apartment near the light rail station wasn't much, but it was what she could afford on her salary. Every morning she took the train to work. Every evening she came home, usually too tired to do much more than watch Netflix and heat up leftovers. Her cat, Max, was often her only company during these quiet evenings. She'd chosen this apartment specifically because it was close to public transportation and allowed pets. The winter had been particularly lonely since her boyfriend of 3 years moved to Texas for a job opportunity. Their breakup was amicable, but left an emptiness in her daily routine that she couldn't seem to fill. Her co-workers at Target were friendly enough, but most were either much younger or much older, with different life priorities. The break room conversations about high school drama or grandchildren only highlighted how isolated she felt. Sometimes entire days would pass where her only meaningful conversations were with customers asking about return policies. Her younger sister Amy had been pushing her to try Bumble for months, insisting it wasn't like other dating apps. "You can control who messages first," she'd say during their weekly phone call, "and lots of normal people use it now." After another Friday night alone, watching couples shop together during her closing shift, Jessica finally decided to give it a try. The quiet in her apartment had started to feel heavy, and even Max seemed to think she needed more human interaction. Creating her profile felt awkward but necessary. She chose recent, normal photos, one at Garden of the Gods with friends, another at a Rockies game, a hiking picture at Red Rocks, and a simple selfie from her cousin's wedding. Her bio kept things basic. Target employee by day, Netflix expert by night, dog and cat person, looking for someone genuine to explore Denver with. Nothing that could identify which store she worked at or where exactly she lived. The app's setup process felt both exciting and terrifying. She set her preferences carefully, ages 25-32, within 15 miles of Denver, no smokers. Her sister had warned her about being too specific, but also about casting too wide a net. Jessica added a few interests: hiking, movies, trying new restaurants, but kept everything vague enough to be safe. Amy had coached her on what information to share and what to keep private. Those first few days of swiping left and right felt like entering a whole new world. Some profiles were obviously fake, too perfect, too polished. Others seemed aggressively casual, trying too hard to look effortless. She matched with a few people, but the conversations fizzled quickly, usually dying after basic questions about work and hobbies. Nothing felt quite right until Ryan's profile appeared. Ryan's profile seemed refreshingly normal compared to the others. Age 28, working as an accountant, with photos that looked genuine, playing with his dog at a park, watching a sunset from his balcony, out with friends at a local brewery. His bio made her laugh. "Accountant who can balance both books and work-life priorities, looking for someone to help me explore Denver's food scene. I promise not to bore you with tax jokes." Everything about him seemed authentic and grounded. Their first messages flowed naturally. Talking about favorite local restaurants and sharing customer service horror stories. Ryan seemed to understand retail work without pitying her. Shared funny stories about difficult clients, and actually asked questions about her interests beyond the surface level. When he suggested meeting for coffee at a popular spot downtown, it felt like a natural progression. The location was public, always busy, and close to several of her co-workers' regular haunts. Before agreeing to meet, Jessica did her homework. His LinkedIn profile checked out, showing a steady job history at a local accounting firm. His Instagram was normal, not too curated, not too messy. They even had a few mutual friends, though not close ones. Everything seemed to verify that he was exactly who he claimed to be. She shared his profile with Amy and her work friend Sarah, letting them know when and where she'd be meeting him, the day before their planned coffee date. Something odd happened at work. A customer knew her name before looking at her name tag, mentioned the coffee shop where she was meeting Ryan, then disappeared into the store before she could ask how they knew. When she told Ryan about it later, he seemed unusually interested in which Target she worked at and her usual schedule. His questions felt just a little too specific. Their text conversations had been steady but reasonable until then. But after mentioning the strange customer, Ryan's messages became more frequent. He asked about her work schedule, her commute route, whether she usually worked registers or the floor. Each question seemed innocent enough alone, but together they started forming a pattern that made her slightly uneasy. Still, she told herself she was being paranoid. That night, checking her social media before bed, Jessica noticed some odd activity. Several new followers on Instagram, all with generic names and no posts. Friend requests on Facebook from people she didn't know but who somehow had mutual friends with Ryan. When she mentioned this to him, his response came too quickly, too smoothly, explaining it all away as coincidence. His explanations made sense, but something felt rehearsed about them. The coffee meeting started normally enough. Ryan arrived on time, looked like his photos, and kept the conversation light and friendly. But she noticed small things that seemed off. He sat facing her section at work through the coffee shop window. Though she hadn't told him which Target she worked at, he knew her usual coffee order without asking. Claiming he'd noticed it in her photos, though she'd never posted any coffee pictures, his smile appeared genuine but practiced, like he'd rehearsed this meeting. Over the next few days, strange coincidences began piling up. Ryan seemed to shop at her Target during all her shifts, always with a plausible reason for being there. He knew which departments she worked in on different days, which entrance she used, even which break room she preferred. When she switched sections with a coworker, he somehow knew exactly where to find her. Each time he had a reasonable explanation, but the explanations started feeling hollow. Other employees began mentioning a friendly customer who asked questions about her, when she worked, what her schedule was like. If she took public transportation, he would chat with different workers each time, gathering pieces of information that seemed harmless individually. Sometimes he would buy small items from various departments, always managing to check out in her line when she was on register. Nobody thought it was strange enough to report. Her phone started showing signs of interference. Apps she didn't download appeared on her home screen. Location services kept turning on by themselves. Her social media accounts showed login attempts from unknown devices. Each time she changed a password, Ryan would text immediately after, asking if she was having phone troubles. He always had suggestions about fixing the problems, always knew exactly what might be wrong. The light rail rides home became increasingly tense. She started noticing the same faces too often, catching glimpses of someone who looked like Ryan on different cars. Her usual stops suddenly felt exposed and unsafe. She varied her routine, taking different trains or getting off at different stations, but somehow he always seemed to know which route she'd chosen. Text messages would arrive commenting on her new commute choice. Her small apartment no longer felt like a sanctuary. Items seemed slightly moved when she came home. Nothing obvious enough to report, just small changes in how she'd left things. The maintenance log showed entries for times she hadn't requested any work. Even Max acted differently, staring at corners of rooms, hissing at shadows under the door. She started taking photos of how she left her apartment each morning, comparing details when she returned. The facade finally cracked during a closing shift at Target. Jessica spotted Ryan in the store 2 hours before closing, methodically walking each aisle with a notebook. When confronted, his friendly accountant persona disappeared completely. "You should really be more careful about leaving your spare key with building maintenance," he said. "Anyone could make a copy." His smile now looked nothing like the one from his profile photos. Investigation revealed the extent of his deception. The accounting firm he claimed to work for had never heard of him. His social media accounts were carefully constructed fakes, filled with stolen photos and manufactured connections. The mutual friends they supposedly shared didn't actually know him. Every piece of his identity had been crafted to intersect perfectly with her life, built from months of observation before he ever matched with her on Bumble. Security footage from Target showed how long he'd been watching, months of visits. Carefully timed to her schedule, he'd built relationships with other employees, gathering information piece by piece. Her apartment's security cameras revealed late-night visits while she slept, careful studies of her routines. The dating app was just his final step, a way to enter her life after learning everything about it. The police discovered notebooks filled with details about her life, her schedule, her routes to work, conversations she'd had with customers and co-workers. He'd documented everything, building a complete picture of her patterns and relationships. Photos showed her through windows, on the train, walking to work, hundreds of images spanning months before they matched online. He'd studied her thoroughly before crafting his perfect profile. Other retail workers in Denver came forward with similar stories. Matches with someone using different names but the same methods, always watching, always collecting information, always using the public nature of their jobs against them. He targeted people who worked in stores, using their scheduled shifts and customer service requirements to gain access to their lives. Each time, he created a new identity perfectly tailored to his target. The investigation uncovered his real identity. A former retail security guard fired for stalking employees. He used his knowledge of store operations and security systems to exploit vulnerabilities in public-facing jobs. The accountant persona was just his latest character, one of many he'd created to get close to people who worked in accessible, predictable environments. Each identity was carefully crafted to appear safe until it wasn't. Jessica transferred to a different target location, changed apartments, altered every routine she could. But retail work meant staying public, staying visible, staying vulnerable. Every customer interaction now carried an undercurrent of fear. Every friendly conversation could be reconnaissance. Every regular customer could be someone studying her patterns. She kept working because she had to, but nothing felt safe anymore. The hardest part was losing trust in normal interactions. Work became an endless exercise in hypervigilance, watching who watched her, noting who asked too many questions, tracking customers who appeared too frequently. Even basic tasks like restocking shelves required constant awareness of her surroundings. She found herself counting how many times she saw the same faces, analyzing every casual comment for hidden meaning. Technology became a source of constant anxiety, even after changing her phone number and locking down her social media. Strange things kept happening. Unknown applications would appear on her phone. Location services would turn on by themselves. Friend requests would come from empty profiles that seemed to know her new routines. Each device felt like a potential breach in her privacy, a window someone could use to watch her. Her apartment complex upgraded their security, but cameras and key fobs couldn't stop the fear. She installed her own cameras, changed her locks repeatedly, put sensors on every window. Max became her early warning system, his reaction to sounds and movements helping her track anything unusual, but sometimes she'd wake up to find things slightly moved, as if someone wanted her to know they could still get in if they wanted to. Denver felt smaller now, its familiar streets mapped with invisible threats. She kept living, kept working, refused to let fear completely control her life. But she understood now that some dangers didn't look dangerous at all. They looked normal, friendly, perfectly crafted to seem safe. Every shift at work became a practice in caution, every customer interaction a potential risk. The city she'd loved now felt like a stage where anyone could be watching. The dating apps were long deleted, but the lessons remained. Jessica still worked retail, still took the light rail, still tried to live a normal life. But she knew now that the scariest predators weren't the obvious ones. They were the ones who took time to study you, who learned your patterns, who used your daily routines as weapons against you. Every morning, walking into Target, she scanned the parking lot, knowing that somewhere, someone might still be taking notes about her new schedule. Amy Chen worked as a server at a busy family restaurant chain in suburban Atlanta. At 26, she shared a 2-bedroom apartment with her friend from college, splitting rent in a complex that was nothing special, but had decent security and covered parking. Her routine was simple: morning shifts during the week, doubles on weekends, and classes at Georgia State working toward her business degree. The tips were good enough to cover bills and tuition. Even if the hours were long and the work exhausting, the late summer heat made Atlanta feel smaller somehow, trapping her in a cycle of work, school, and sleep. Her roommate Nicole traveled frequently for her sales job, leaving Amy alone most weeknights with just her laptop and textbooks for company. After ending a 2-year relationship with another server at work, she'd switched locations to avoid the awkwardness, starting fresh at a new restaurant but feeling more isolated than ever. Her sister had met her husband on Bumble last year and wouldn't stop suggesting Amy try it. "It's different now," she'd insist during their Sunday phone call. "You can take your time, be selective." After another lonely closing shift watching families and couples enjoy their meals together, Amy finally downloaded. Maybe it would be better than the constant attempts at setups from well-meaning coworkers. Setting up her profile felt strange but methodical. She chose recent photos that felt safe. At her graduation from community college, hiking at Stone Mountain, celebrating a friend's birthday at Ponce City Market, and one nice headshot from her cousin's wedding. Her bio kept things simple: server and student who loves good food and better conversation, looking for someone real in a city of endless first dates. The app settings became a careful checklist: ages 26-33, no more than 15 miles from her area, no smokers. She'd seen enough at the restaurant to know what she didn't want. Her sister helped her set boundaries about what information to share and what to keep private. No mentioning which restaurant she worked at, no specific school details, nothing that could let someone find her too easily. Those first few days swiping felt like screening job applications. Some profiles were obviously fake, too polished, too perfect. Others seemed aggressively casual, trying too hard to look effortless. She matched with several people, but the conversations went nowhere, dying out after basic questions about work and school. Nothing clicked until David's profile appeared. David's profile looked refreshingly genuine. Age 30, working in medical sales, with photos that seemed natural, playing with his German Shepherd at a dog park, having dinner with friends at a restaurant she recognized, volunteering at a local food bank. His bio made her laugh. Sales rep who knows every good restaurant in Atlanta because it's technically work. Looking for someone to help rate every brunch spot in the city. Everything about him felt authentic. Their first messages connected over restaurant industry stories. David seemed to understand service work without condescending about it, shared funny stories about difficult clients, and asked thoughtful questions about her studies. When he suggested meeting for coffee at a popular spot in Midtown, it felt safe. The location was public, always busy, and right by where her work friend Sarah lived, an easy escape plan if needed. Before agreeing, Amy did her research. His LinkedIn profile showed a steady career in medical sales at a legitimate company. His Instagram was normal, not too curated, but not messy. They even had a few mutual connections through the restaurant industry, though not close ones. Everything verified that he was who he claimed to be. She shared his profile with her sister and Sarah, letting them know when and where she'd be meeting him. The day before their planned coffee date, something odd happened at work. A customer mentioned knowing her from Bumble, though they hadn't matched. He knew which coffee shop she was meeting David at, then disappeared before she could ask questions. When she told David about it later, he seemed overly interested in which restaurant she worked at and her usual sections. His questions felt just a little too specific. Their text conversations had been steady but comfortable until then. After mentioning the strange customer, David's messages increased dramatically. He asked about her schedule, her sections, whether she usually closed alone. Each question seemed innocent enough by itself. But together they formed a pattern that made her uneasy. Still, she told herself she was being too suspicious. That night, checking her social media before bed, Amy noticed unusual activity. Several new followers on Instagram, all with generic names and no posts. Friend requests on Facebook from people she didn't know, but who somehow had mutual friends with David. When she mentioned this to him, his response came too quickly, dismissing it all as coincidence. His explanations made sense, but something felt rehearsed about them. The coffee meeting felt scripted from the start. David arrived precisely on time, looked exactly like his photos, and kept the conversation flowing smoothly. But small things felt wrong. He knew which section she usually served at work without her telling him. He mentioned her typical closing routine, claiming a friend had seen her at work. His smile never quite reached his eyes, like he was performing rather than talking. Over the next week, strange coincidences multiplied. David appeared at her restaurant during different shifts, always with a plausible reason for being there. He knew which sections she worked on different days, which entrance she used, even where she parked her car. When she switched sections with co-workers, he somehow found her anyway. Each time he had an explanation, but they started sounding hollow. Other servers began mentioning a friendly customer who asked questions about her, when she worked, what her schedule was like. If she usually left alone, he would chat with different staff members each time, collecting bits of information that seemed harmless alone. Sometimes he would sit in different sections, always managing to keep her in view. Nobody thought it was strange enough to report. Her phone started behaving strangely. Apps she never installed appeared. Location services kept activating themselves. Her social media showed login attempts from unknown devices. Each time she changed a password, David would text immediately, asking if she was having phone problems. He always had technical suggestions, always knew exactly what might be wrong. The drive home became increasingly tense. She started noticing the same cars too often, catching glimpses of someone who looked like David in different vehicles. Her usual route suddenly felt exposed and dangerous. She varied her path home, taking different streets or exits. But somehow he always seemed to know which way she'd chosen. Messages would arrive commenting on her new route. Her apartment no longer felt safe. Things seemed slightly moved when she came home. Nothing obvious enough to report. Just small changes in how she'd left them. The building's security log showed entries during times she hadn't authorized any maintenance. She started taking photos of how she left her apartment each morning, comparing details when she returned. Something was wrong, but she couldn't prove exactly what. The facade cracked during a slow afternoon shift. Amy spotted David sitting in another server's section, writing in a notebook and watching her work. When confronted, his friendly sales rep persona vanished. "You should really be more careful about sharing your location on social media," he said. "Anyone could track your patterns." His smile now looked nothing like the one in his profile photo. Research revealed the depth of his deception. The medical sales company had never heard of him. His social media was carefully constructed fiction, filled with edited photos and fake connections. The mutual friends they supposedly shared didn't actually know him. Every piece of his identity had been crafted to intersect perfectly with her life, built from months of watching her before he ever matched on Bumble. Security footage from her restaurant showed the timeline. Months of visits, carefully timed to her schedule. He'd built relationships with other staff members, gathering information piece by piece. Her apartment's cameras revealed late-night visits while she slept, careful studies of her routines. The dating app was just his final move, a way to enter her life after learning everything about it. Police found notebooks detailing every aspect of her life, her schedule, her routes home, conversations she'd had with customers and coworkers. He documented everything, creating a complete picture of her patterns and relationships. Photos showed her through windows, in parking lots, walking to her car. Hundreds of images spanning months before they matched online. He'd studied her thoroughly before crafting his perfect profile. Other servers in Atlanta came forward with similar stories. Matches with someone using different names but the same methods. Always watching, always collecting information, always using the public nature of their jobs against them. He targeted people in the service industry, using their predictable schedules and customer service requirements to gain access to their lives. Each time, he created a new identity perfectly tailored to his target. Investigation uncovered his true identity, a former restaurant manager fired for stalking employees. He used his knowledge of restaurant operations and service industry patterns to exploit vulnerabilities in public-facing jobs. The sales rep persona was just his latest character, one of many he'd created to get close to people who worked in accessible, predictable environments. Each identity was carefully crafted to appear safe until it wasn't. Amy transferred to a different restaurant location, moved apartments, changed every routine she could. But service industry work meant staying visible, staying exposed. Every customer interaction now carried an undertone of fear. Every friendly conversation could be gathering intelligence. Every regular customer could be someone studying her patterns. She kept working because she had to, but nothing felt normal anymore. The hardest part was losing trust in ordinary interactions. Work became an endless exercise in vigilance. Watching who watched her, noting who asked too many questions, tracking customers who appeared too frequently. Even basic tasks like taking orders required constant awareness of her surroundings. She found herself counting how many times she saw the same faces, analyzing every casual comment for hidden meaning. Technology became a source of constant anxiety. Even after changing her phone number and locking down her social media, strange things kept happening. Unknown apps would appear on her phone. Location services would turn on by themselves. Friend requests would come from empty profiles that seemed to know her new routines. Each device felt like a potential breach in her privacy, a window someone could use to watch her. Her new apartment complex had better security, but cameras and key fobs couldn't stop the fear. She installed her own cameras, changed her locks regularly, put alarms on every window, but sometimes she'd wake up to find things slightly moved, as if someone wanted her to know they could still get in if they wanted to. The feeling of being watched never fully went away. Atlanta felt smaller now, its familiar streets mapped with invisible threats. She kept living, kept working, refused to let fear completely control her life. But she understood now that some dangers didn't look dangerous at all. They looked normal, friendly, perfectly crafted to seem safe. Every shift at work became a practice in caution. Every customer interaction a potential risk. The city she'd loved now felt like a stage where anyone could be watching. The dating apps were long deleted, but the lessons remained. Amy still served tables, still took classes, still tried to live a normal life. But she knew now that the scariest predators weren't the obvious ones. They were the ones who took time to study you, who learned your patterns, who used your daily routines as weapons against you. Every morning, walking into the restaurant, she scanned the dining room, knowing that somewhere, someone might still be taking notes about her new schedule.